Okay, thank you, and thank you everyone for giving up some of your Saturday evening to listen to this talk. I know that in the UK, at least, I'm clashing with Strictly Come Dancing, so I'm just flattered by the numbers, and delighted to share some Lewis with you. That birthday cake clip art on the slide is just because this year is the 250th anniversary of Lewis's birth. It's the same with Jane Austen, and I've seen a few things celebrating it about Austen, but nothing about Lewis. So I thought I'd make just a small contribution to marking him. As Sam has just said, Lewis is mostly known now for his novel The Monk, but actually he wrote much more drama than he did prose. It's just a lot of drama from that era has been forgotten about. The commercial, popular and critical success of his works at the stage varied quite a lot, but what didn't vary was his use of lots of exciting Gothic tropes and Gothic struck characters, and its heroes and villains and masculine characterization that I really like about the plays and wanted to look at today, with a bit of input from some theories about masculinity that are roughly contemporary with him. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. This quotation is from Paul Ranger's book, Gothic Drama. It's one of the few full-length works exploring that genre on stage at that period in history. And he looks at character types using this quotation, which I think sums up a lot of things. So I thought it was worth raising at the start. He describes the villain as a personification of relentless greed or self-devouring jealousy. And our first villain today has both of those things, and our second one has certainly the greed. And he writes about a divided hero who is a man at odds with himself. And I think a lot of Gothic heroes from the famous Gothic novels are almost too good to be true, but they don't really get a lot done. And Lewis's heroes on the stage are much more like that quotation. They've got aspects of the character features which makes villains interesting without the flaws and the vices which makes them villains. Yeah, so I found that quite a useful one looking at these plays. If we move on to the next slide, please, Sam. Thank you. Just a small bit of context before we get stuck into the dramas proper. During the time Lewis was writing, and most of these plays are between 1797 and 1812. So there was quite a lot of upheaval in England nationally and politically, and quite a lot for Lewis personally as well. So nationally, there were reports of revolts overseas on plantations. The abolitionist cause was rising to end the slave trade. England was at war with France. France had had a revolution. Towards the latter stage of Lewis's writing career, there was also the Regency crisis in the UK as well, with the madness of King George III. So there's a lot of social fear of revolution and disorder and power gone wrong, and worries about how to maintain power in a positive way in the status quo. More personally, Lewis's family was not free from scandal. His mother eloped with the family music teacher, causing a huge social scandal at the time. His father tried to get a divorce, but at the time that had to be heard in Parliament, and they refused. And Lewis supported his mother financially for the rest of his life. The affair led to his mother giving birth to Lewis's half-sister, Miss Lacey, and we'll hear a tiny bit about more about her later as well. And Lewis was an MP for a short time. He was a member of Parliament, so these political crises were directly related to him. He was fairly inactive as an MP, but he still has that connection. So I think one of the things that a lot of his plays on stage do is gothicize and make into a spectacle threats to power structures, and quite often that is through the characters of the heroes and villains. All right, so if we move on, one small bit of background. So something I like to think of as Lewis's origin story is his time overseas in Weimar between 1792 and 93. He interrupted his university studies to visit the continent. His father was intending him for a political career. So it was related to that. He became an attaché at The Hague. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see that he writes to his mother about some really horrific violence that he sees as part of the war in Europe. So both of these extracts are from a letter from 22nd of November 1794, I've written in my notes. I saw two cannonballs pass through the roof of a house about 10 yards distant. A ball passed through the house into the shelter of whose roof I was standing. I was much shocked at seeing a countryman whose leg had been shot away at that moment, as he was sitting at his cottage door, and the same ball carried off the arm of his child, an infant of 3 years old, which he held upon his knee. So that is really quite horrific. And for all the furore about the violence in some of his works, The Monk especially, I think few can actually match witnessing that. And he would only have been in his late teens at this point as well. Later in the same letter, he laments the effect that the war and the actions of the English soldiers are having on how the English are viewed. He says the French are adored wherever they go, while the Allied forces are execrated and detested. In truth, I'm sorry to confess that no ravages more wanton and justifiable were ever committed in the annals of war than have been perpetrated by the combined army, and more particularly by the English. So there's a sense that the English have especially got themselves to blame for all this. Whatever these unjustifiable ravages are that they have committed, it's leading to more discontent and more threat. And misuse of power is also something that is the marker of a villain in Lewis's works. Okay, so that's the context done. Now we can skip to the fun stuff. Okay. If we move on a slide. Okay, so Lewis's outright villain, I want to say first, but I know some people will consider Ambrosio in The Monk as the first, but his first big stage villain, Osmond in The Castle Spectre. This is from 1797, so it's just after The Monk. An overview of this play. Before the play starts, Osmond, who is our villain, has murdered a character called Evelina, who he was in love with and who was married to his brother Reginald. Reginald also believed dead, but has been rescued by a loyal servant and is somewhat unrealistically surviving chained up in a dungeon. By the time the play starts, Reginald and Evelina's daughter Angela is now captive in this castle, which is Conway Castle in Wales. This is a British set Gothic. She's being held there by Osmond, who has now transferred his lust to her as his niece, following in the lines of Gothic villains with sort of incestuous tendencies. And Angela is in love with a young nobleman called Percy. At this point, she believes him to be a peasant called Edwy. He turns out to be the Earl of Northumberland, luckily for all concerned. And the play features Angela and, Percy trying to rescue Angela, an eventual reconciliation with Reginald, and Osmond's descent into guilt. And the spectre of the title is Evelina, who appears to defend her daughter and terrify her murderer. So this was Lewis's most successful play commercially. It had 47 performances between December 1797 and June 1798. And according to James Allard, it raised about £18,000 in the box office, which is huge. It was quite controversial. The use of a ghost on stage was controversial, and there are also four black characters that are Osmond's servants, who were considered quite controversial at the time as well. Some of the sentiments that they express and the sympathetic nature of the character of Hassan in particular read to the Monthly Visitor, suggesting that Lewis was encouraging revolts among the enslaved. So there's quite a political context to the way the play was seen, but it didn't stop people going to see it and just enjoying the spectacle. Paul Ranger called it a Georgian morality play because of the way that virtue and vice are so separate, so distinct in the characters of Angela and Osmond. And because of his belief fratricide and incestuous lust, Osmond feels very guilty, and it's his response to that guilt and the way it manifests himself that marks him out as the cause of his villainy being essentially corrupt aristocracy. Bertrand Evans notes that he displays that sense of guilt much more ostentatiously than any previous villain, and that he possesses a high degree of attractiveness and truly admirable qualities, and that he blends the haughty, the cruel, and the pitiable, and the grand in a way that is calculated to gratify the actor, the censor, and the public. So there's a sense that if Lewis is sort of critically mocked for plays that are not very serious, he knows what he's doing in terms of getting interest from actors and keeping bums on seats. So the fact that Osmond's attempted fratricide of Reginald, it's a double act of usurpation, basically, for both of the family, because he wants Evelina, and socially because he wants Reginald's title. So it's a double threat to patriarchal power structures because it completely disrupts primogeniture. If we go to the next slide, this is Osmond's speech showing his jealousy of Reginald. And I think it's quite tellingly constructed. Yet for that hatred had I not cause. At tournaments, 'twas on Reginald that each bright eye was bent. At court, was to Reginald that each noble proffered friendship. Evelina too, ha! At that name my expiring hate revives. Reginald, Reginald, for thee was I sacrificed. Oh, when it strikes a second blow, my poniard shall stab surer. So he starts that with quite controlled rhetoric. He uses anaphora, so repeating the same word or phrase at the start of sentences or clauses when he says 'twas on Reginald and 'twas to Reginald. And that type of repetition is quite typical of Lewis's heroes, because it's control of speech suggests control of self and of the situation and power that is working. And it starts off okay with Osmond here, but then towards the end of it, once he starts thinking about Evelina, he starts interrupting himself. He starts using much more violent language. And we can see that he's starting to degenerate. Okay, and if we move on to the next slide, thank you. He oscillates like that for quite a lot of the play. He moves between seeming quite reasoned and also being terrifyingly lacking in reason. So when he's thinking about Angela, he says, what though her heart be purses, because my short-lived joy may cause her eternal sorrow, shall I reject those pleasures sought so long, desired so earnestly? That I will not, by heaven. Mine she is, and mine she shall be. So he's quite exclamatory. When he upbraids Percy for tricking him and not making his identity clear immediately, although he's being really disingenuous about it, he does manage to make himself sound quite reasonable and like an assured aristocrat. Earl, nothing can justify unworthy means. If you were wronged, why sought you not your right with your sword's point? I then should have esteemed you a noble foe, and as such would have treated you. But you have stooped to paltry artifice, and attract me like some midnight ruffian, privately and in disguise. By this I am authorized to forget your station. So he's, ironically, though he doesn't necessarily realizing it, attacking Percy's station, his nobility, and his sense of masculine courage by not attacking him with his sword's point. He then starts to muse further on guilt. So if we move on again, he loses the ability to be content. This is him hearing happy peasants singing at the end of a day's work outside of the castle. And he says, how fair, how tranquil all without, how dark, how comfortless all within. He describes the peasants as moving with gay and careless steps, caroling as they go, some rustic ditty, because Gothic peasants want to sing of an evening, and will pass the night in rest, for they have passed the day in innocence. And he can't do that. His guilt means that he cannot rest easy. It's eating him from within. It gets worse. He addresses night in a way that reminds me, at least, of Macbeth and Milton's Satan. He says, fly from my eyes, bright day, speeds thy pace, darkness. Thou art my love. Haste to unfold thy sable mantle and robe the world in the colour of my soul. So he's referring to himself as darkness to symbolize his guilt, and that matches him with the dark castle as well. Okay, if we move on, thank you. He's now taken Percy prisoner in order to use that to blackmail Angela. And at this point, the important bit is the middle and the end of the quotation. He says, yes, I am guilty. Heaven, how guilty. Yet lies the fault with me. Did my own pleasure plant in my bosom these tempestuous passions? No. Nature formed me the slave of wild desires, and fate, as she found upon my cradle, exclaimed, I doom this babe to be a villain and a wretch. So he takes no responsibility for his own actions at all. It's nature and fate. He was born this way. And that refusal to take ownership and to take responsibility for his faults is yet another marker of villainy. The heroes not only have self-control and courage, they usually are aware of their public duty as well, and he's not thinking about what he should be doing at all. James Fordyce, who wrote conduct books and sermons around this time, wrote an essay called On a Manly Spirit as opposed to Cowardice. He holds up the Black Prince from English history in that as an idealized example of brave male virtues. And that's because, in Fordyce's words, he had all his passions under control. Osmond, as I just noticed, I'm keeping an eye not on the chat, but a speech bubble popped up saying exclamations in drama. And absolutely, that indicates Osmond doesn't have his passions in control at all. And he is increasingly afraid his masculinity is being degraded by his behaviour. It continues to degenerate. He has a nightmare, and we can see his response to that nightmare in the next slide. We move on. Thank you. So anguish, endless, hopeless anguish is his reward for his behaviour. Day or night, no moment of rest. When I sleep, dreams of strange horrors still fright me from my couch. When I wake, I find in every object some cause for distrust. Read the dread change in every eye. Thou art a murderer, and tremble lest the agents of my guilt should work its punishment. So he is increasingly afraid. He cannot sleep easily. These nightmares are related to his conscience. Okay, and it continues. So on the next slide. Let me not hear the damning truth. Tell me not that flames await me. By this point, he is barely coherent. He says in this one, plunge me rather in the thickest gloom of atheism. So he can't think about eternal life. Say that with my body must perish my soul, because he thinks he's going to be punished for eternity. He's interrupting himself. Oh, should my fearful dream prove prophetic? And then he moves on to recounting what happened in the dream. Methought I wandered through the low-browed caverns where reposed the relics of my ancestors. My eye dwelt with awe on her tombs. the state of his anguish there, the exclamatory tone of it, it's really different to the way that Reginald speaks later. And his level of dread and guilt is so strong that it's actually used as an example of that emotion in an acting manual. So on the next slide, hopefully, yeah, we've got a quotation from Henry Siddons's Practical Illustrations of Rhetorical Gesture and Action. And in this one, Siddons writes that Osmond ought to retreat from some object present to his mental eye, which inspires him with terror and which he is all anxiety to remove himself. So be so afraid he can't bear to look upon things because they trigger that response in him. They trigger his awareness of his guilt. The character of Hassan, who is one of those anachronistic black servants he has, also warns him against having the dream unman him. So there is this sense that some part of his masculinity is being lost. And he also faints a little bit like a heroine when Angela finally confronts him with the knife that he used to murder her mother. So he's frightened, he's irrational, he's effeminized, and this is due to his failure to adhere to masculine codes of behaviour and masculine power structures. By contrast, if we look at Reginald and Percy, starting on the next slide, thank you. Lewis in this play also introduces two character types which feature heavily in his dramas, and that's the older, very wise patrician figure, which is Reginald here, and the younger noble hero. And in this quotation, Reginald has also had a dream about his lost family, but unlike Osmond, whose dream terrifies him, in this one, Reginald is sad to wake up. Fly me not, lovely forms, they are gone. Once more I live to misery. Thou wert kind to me, sleep. Frown not on me, therefore, darkness. God, thou knowest I have ever borne my sufferings meekly, sorrowed for thy anger, but never murmured at it. I have wept myself, but never cursed thy foes. So he is able to address God. He has none of the fears that Osmond does. And although he is quite emotionally excited towards the first part of that, he is much calmer at the end of that quotation than Osmond is for much of the play. If we move on, thank you. This quotation is from the point where Reginald and Osmond confront each other, and he's really saying that his brother should be grateful to him. He points out that he saved his brother's life. He said, when he's accused of being a foe, was I one when my weapon struck the fierce Scot to the ground? We've got on another one. Thank you. Whose sword already glittered above your head? Was I one when embarrassed by your armour, you sank between the Severn's waves? I sprang into the flood. I seized. I saved you. Twice have I preserved your life. So there's that repetition at the start of sentences again, as he is reminding Osmond that his duty and his gratitude is due to him as his older, preserving brother. I find that contrast quite interesting. I think he's definitely teaching Osmond a lesson there. If we move on to the next slide, which is, thank you. This one is just Reginald musing on how guilty Osmond must feel, and he gets it quite right. Far greater must have been his pangs than mine in his gloomy dungeon. So more harm is being done to Osmond through his guilty conscience than is to Reginald through being chained up. What gave me hope was his despair. I knew I was guiltless. So that sense that he is right, that he is virtuous, is what keeps him controlled and together. Okay, if we move on very swiftly. Moving on to heroes. So in the Castle Spectre, Percy's the younger hero. Lewis dismisses him as a mighty, pretty behaved gentleman with no character at all, which is quite a damning thing to say about one of your own creations. I think it's true that Percy, he means well, but he doesn't get too much agency. He doesn't get to be the one who succeeds in defeating the villain. It's Angela who stabs Osmond in the end. But he tries. There is one point where he dresses up in a suit of armour and makes it move so it looks like it's possessed, which frightens Osmond. And that is a meta-theatrical representation of rightful power, somebody who is higher in the social hierarchy, using that as a reminder of where that power lies to the usurper. He's also got a reputation through doing good to his dependents. He's quite paternalistic, and that's something that gains Angela's respect before she knows that he is an earl when she thinks he's still a peasant. And in the epilogue to the play, the character of Angela describes him as the pride of our English youth. So masculine virtue is being linked to national traits. Okay. After this play, there's a spate of Lewis's career where quite a lot of his plays focus on eponymous heroes. Michael R. Booth wrote in 1965 that Lewis doesn't seem concerned with the melodramatic potential of heroes. I disagree. I just think Lewis plays around with the character type a bit. If we move to the next slide. This quotation is from William Hazlitt's essay, Why the Heroes of Romance Are Insipid, from Men and Manners, which was published in 2 volumes between 1821 to 22. And he has a good-natured dig at some Gothic heroes from the page more than the stage, but Anne Radcliffe especially. He claims that they are bland because that allows the reader to superimpose their own ideals on them, and therefore everybody loves these heroes. And he says nobody can find any fault with them, for nobody knows anything about them. Theodore, Valancourt, what delightful names, and there is nothing else to distinguish them. Lewis's heroes, I think, are a bit different. They mostly do have agency. A couple that we will look at today do. They do, if they don't always rescue the hero, they do at least manage to right some wrongs. So they rescue the heroine, they do manage to right some wrongs. And they have got a focus on restoration of social order as well. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll have a look at 2 plays quite briefly, and then Venoni in little more detail. Adelmorn the Outlaw. This is from 1801, but first drafted in 1795. So it's quite close in time to the Monk and to the Castle Spectre. Prior to the start of this play, the character of Roderick has been murdered by his nephew Ulrich, and Adelmorn has been framed for this and believes himself guilty because on the night of the murder he was attacked and he didn't see anything. It was dark, conveniently, but he did manage to wound his attacker, and he thinks that that was the action which killed Roderick. It wasn't, and the audience is never really in much doubt that he's innocent. He's also married the character of Imogen in secret, and they have moved to Germany. And back in their home country, Imogen is believed to have died in a convent, just to throw in another Gothic trope to the mix. And her father is Sigismund. So that's a summary of the play. The play is actually a really short one, and it deals with Adelmorn being an outlaw, feeling guilt, although he's actually innocent of the crime he's been guilty of, and then eventually discovering that he is innocent and the real culprit, Ulrich, being given a punishment. This one was a commercial flop. If The Castle Spectre was an absolute box office smash, this one flopped for quite a few reasons. It wasn't helped by the fact there were some issues with the staging, which led to audience laughter. So if we go to the next slide, there's a quotation from the character Sigismund. And at this point, the fact that Ulrich is the real guilty party has been discovered, Sigismund is now realizing that his daughter is married to Adelmorn, and he is pulling up Ulrich on his faults. Hereafter you may sorrow that when your sovereign sues to you, you suffered him to sue in vain, when you may feel what I now feel so bitterly, that they who show not mercy when others sue deserve no mercy when they sue themselves. And that's only 2 sentences, believe it or not. But yet again, there's this repetition at key points of the sentences where he is using his control of the situation to really put Ulrich in his place. And there's also a focus on the quality of mercy and benevolence in a ruler in order to gain the goodwill and therefore biddability of the people. So that is Sigismund as one of the older rulers. The next one, next slide. This is Adelmorn. This is earlier in the play. He is feeling guilt and emotional oppression. And this is Act 2, Scene 2. And he's wandering through a dark, typically Gothic forest. And he feels frightened because he feels guilty. Peace, peace, was but the bat which flitted by me. 'Twas but the owl which shrieked from yonder tree. So trying to reassure himself because he's so jumpy walking through this wood. While your heart was unconscious of guilt, Adelmorn, and your hand unstained with blood, you were not thus used to tremble. But now, fool that I am, I shudder at the falling leaf. Guilt, guilt. Oh, what a coward hast thou made of me. So he seems fearful and guilty. He's not unlike Osmond. But then so quickly it's almost comic timing. This sense is that he is guilty and cowardly is completely undercut when there's an offstage shriek and he pulls out his sword, shouts, "Guide me, good angels," and goes rushing off to physically interpose for whoever is being attacked. And the fact that he can do that he has physical courage, that he can invoke heaven, is really a sign to the audience that he isn't guilty at all. We're just waiting to see who really is. But in the meantime, Adelmorn has all the dramatic interest of a villain without any of the vice. Ulrich, on the other hand, when he is facing evidence of his guilt, we're told starts back in horror and hides his face in his cloak, which is pretty much exactly how Henry Siddons says that a guilty character should act. Okay. All right. If we go to the next slide, in Act 3, Adelmorn has a soliloquy, so a quite lengthy solo speech at the start of this. He's imprisoned and he is demonstrating from his prison cell quite a lot of moral rectitude and fortitude. And because he's innocent but doesn't know it, he can't understand why he feels so calm. He says, "I have no more to hope, no more to fear, and methinks again my soul feels resigned and tranquil. Oh, is this calm but the calm of despair? No, not so." So he's not in despair, which is the sort of depth that Osmond hits. "Let me not wrong thee, best of all blessings, last of all comforts, my uncorrupted heart." He's much more like Reginald here. "My eye need not blink beneath my judges, my breast need not shrink from the searcher's probe." So he doesn't need to be afraid. He doesn't need to be wincing away from things like Osmond and Ulrich do. "One tear of mercy can cleanse my hand from blood, then shrink not my soul from the sunbeams of tomorrow." Okay. So, and then eventually all is well. He is acquitted. Everything is fine for him. Okay. If we move on to our next slide, you've got another play, and I apologise for my misplacing of that photo of the chapbook version of this. It is Rugantino, the Bravo of Venice. And this is another play where the hero, for dramatic interest, appears to have some villainous qualities. And I don't know if anybody is familiar with the old cartoon Scooby-Doo, but if you are, this play is so Scooby-Doo. It's brilliant. It is completely over the top. I love it. In this one, some bravos are planning to overthrow the Doge of Venice. One of them is Rugantino, who's meant to be the most frightening bravo of them all. Except Rugantino isn't really Rugantino. Rugantino, we're told, is really Flodoardo, and Flodoardo is a good guy. He is a hero. He is in love with one of the Doge's relatives, Rosabella, and he's just infiltrating this Bravo gang to subvert it all from within. This one was performed for the first time on October the 18th, 1805. So it is actually Rugantino's birthday today. So I hope everyone is having some cake later, whether or not you use the drama as an excuse. And it was performed for the first time at Covent Garden. This is 2 years after Lewis has entered a rift with his father, and 3 years after he's left Parliament. It's just a year before the death of Pitt leads to a Whig government as well. And it's quite interesting in terms of Lewis's body of work overall, because it has lots of elements that are typical of his work. The play is based on a novella just called The Bravo of Venice, which you can get in as an appendix in the vintage version of The Monk, if you're interested. And that novella was translated from a novella written by a writer, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, but I apologize if I'm not, Joca. And that prose translation was actually translated from that writer's own play. So it moves between literary forms. It's translated from another language, and Lewis did a lot of translation as well. So much of the Gothic threat in this play is really just, it's a complete masquerade. We already know who the hero is. It's just how he's going to foil the bad guys. Flodoardo represents lots of the qualities lauded by another writer on behaviour of the time, Knox. So if we move on to the next slide. Fab, thank you. This is by Simon's Knox on modern heroism. Knox criticises young men who don't learn their Greek and Latin, who revolt against authority, and he mocks them turning to the splendid distinctions of the turf, the gaming table, and the whip. So driving their horses too fast and gambling, basically. Not to mention the illustrious emulation of the Grand Seigneur and the establishment of his seraglio. So mocking the sexual licentiousness of the younger male generation too. These dashing characters may be compared to a dashing torrent, or noise, or foam, or violence for a moment, or to a comet, attracting all eyes for a short time, but cheering no system. So that's quite like Rugantino. But if we go to the next slide, this is what Knox thinks young men should be like. True heroism is best displayed by acting a rational, manly, uniform part. So we've seen some very irrational villains. Heroes are rational. Contrasted with this, the falsifier of the dashing fellow is like the blaze of a handful of straw compared to the undiminished radiance of the vestal flame. So Rugantino's got all the shallow but attractive grammar of the rebel, but actually is a champion of the established order all along. So he's got everything. He's as interesting as a bad boy, but he's a nice boy, really. If we go to the next slide. Okay. The part was played by Miss Johnston, and he seems to have summed up in his appearance those two elements of heroism and villainy, according to Knox, and does that in the roles of Rugantino and Flodoardo. So Margaret Barron Wilson, who is an early biographer of Lewis, says that Mr. Johnson was superlatively ferocious as the dreaded Bravo, but was irresistible as the handsome Florentine, which is Flodoardo. The play tells us that as Rugantino, his costume contains weapons, lots of scars, fake beard, thick eyebrows, black enormous moustaches, and he has a frightening voice of thunder. But Flodoardo has an Apollo-like form, only matched by his actions, which are as good and glorious as a demigod's. So he's being compared to classical heroes at this point. And around this time, classicism is associated with order and successful masculinity as well. And if you would like an explanation of how that manifested itself in male dress, absolutely read in Kelly's biography of Beau Brummel, which is just brilliant. Okay, so we have got two heroes there who are interesting because they seem like villains. If we move on to our next play, our next slide, Venoni, or the Novice of St. Mark's. I think this one is a little bit different. Venoni is our eponymous hero, but I don't think he's quite as heroic as his two predecessors. So this is Lewis's translation of de Monville's play from 1791, Les Victimes Cloîtrées. I apologise for not having a great French accent. It was originally a work of the French Revolution, but Lewis's translation, it was performed for the first time in December 1808, and then the play was published in 1809. So the original French version has the hero and heroine imprisoned by nuns and monks, because what's the Gothic drama without some evil nuns and monks, on the order of a corrupt aristocrat. And then they're eventually rescued by a tricolour-wielding Republican mayor, because it is a play of the French Revolution. Lewis translates the language and, to an extent, some of the sympathies of the play, I think. The character of the mayor is the big one for that. He's replaced by a viceroy. This is now set in Sicily, and he's replaced by the viceroy Benvolio. And I think Benvolio, who is one of those patrician heroes who builds on Reginald and Sigismund, he's actually, I think, the one we're meant to really look up to as a hero. So this version of the play opens with Benvolio's servants waiting for him to come back. So he is somebody whose dependents show a great deal of loyalty to him. And we find out that his niece, Josepha, has supposedly, how's this for a Gothic heroine, died in a convent. And her mother was persuaded to send her there by the Father Colestino, who's disapproved of by Benvolio and the servants. Actually, we find out later that she isn't dead at all. She's been imprisoned because she rejected Colestino's advances. Who saw that coming? Venoni is in love with Josepha, and he is showing as absolutely being taken over by his grief to a really large extent, and that's as much as a threat to him as any of the machinations of Colestino, who's our villain. He decides to become a monk because he can't cope with a worldly life without Josepha. And Benvolio spends most of the play trying to talk him out of this by saying that he has a social duty to fulfill, and reiterating his duty to his country. By the end of the play, again, everything is discovered, lovers are reunited, and all is well, but not before Venoni demonstrates some really excessive behaviour. So yes, you have moved on to the next slide. I forgot this one this morning as well. I don't know why. It's because I'm thinking about Venoni's hyperbolic body language. I apologise that this hasn't photographed close up clearly. It's a really old plate, and it's very, very small, as well as being very fragile. It was quite tricky. But if you can see it, at the bottom of that page, that's the cast list, and we can see the character of Sister Lucia is played by Miss Lacey, and that is very likely Lewis's half sister. He did write to his mother warning her about the dangers of Miss Lacey being on stage, saying it was a very different world for a woman than for a man. Okay, if we move on again. Oh, yeah, thank you. I will come to that in a moment. So Venoni is demonstrating a really lovelorn grief throughout much of this play. There's a lot of broken speech, really hyperbolic body language. He collapses and faints a lot as well. And that's quite common in melodrama and illegitimate theatre styles, which would make him quite a fashionable character in 1809. Theatres by this size, the Patent Theatres in London, were huge. And it is really quite difficult in those theatres, would have been hard from the back of the audience to clearly see what's happening on stage or really hear it. So there is a lot of exaggerated body language, really recognisable semiotics of movement to represent different emotions, and a lot of singing and so on as well, because it's audible. Okay. I think there's quite a lot of public and personal reasons why this play is pertinent to this point in Lewis's career. I'm not necessarily suggesting that's deliberate, but I think there are some interesting parallels with his life. And one of those, I think, because of the way that the Count Benvolio is presented as focusing very much on the importance of public duty and the association between personal virtues and the public role of a young man who's quite high up in society. One of the things from Lewis's life I think is quite important at this point is the Whitelock trial. So Lewis's paternal aunt was married to Lieutenant General Whitelock, and he was involved in a military disaster in 1807, just a year before this version of the play was performed. Whitelock was part of an invasion of Buenos Aires with the intention of removing or reducing Spanish power there. And that was motivated by the fact that Spain were allied to France at this point. And it went very badly wrong. 50 men from two sets of dragoons died, and Whitelock was court-martialed and cashiered, and it was quite a far-spread scandal. This quotation is how Baron Wilson describes it. I won't read every line, but I will pick out some key quotations for you, because I can see that's quite dense there. She says, all hopes have been defeated, which are justly and generally entertained to bring new markets for our manufacturers. So this had an economic impact for the nation, as well as being a military disaster. The disappointment, too, has been cruelly embittered by the disgrace which to failure under all the circumstances have attached to the British arm. A diminution of our military fame must ever be felt as a great national calamity, but at no period so severely as in this crisis of the world, when our military character has become more essential than ever, not merely for our honour and glory, but the independence, the liberties, the existence of Great Britain. That's quite a lot she puts on it there. Like, the existence of Britain depends on events like these, and it didn't go how it should. That trial got a great deal of public interest. There are at least 4 published versions of it that were available for sale. One of those is an Irish chapbook, so it's also been translated, well, produced to people of differing social classes and for over the sea, over in Ireland. So news spread. So this would have been quite a scandal. Baron Wilson doesn't say which of those versions she uses to present her views on the trial, but given the way that she describes the events, I think it's likely to be either the one that was written by a Mr. Gurney or one that's attributed to anonymously to someone just referring to themselves as a student of the Middle Temple. But we can see what he was charged with if we move on. So his first charge is that he demanded the surrender of persons holding civil offices in the government of Buenos Aires as prisoners of war. And that was considered offensive and unusual. It exasperated the inhabitants there. And all that did was prove counterproductive. Okay, if we move on. Thank you. These are the next 2. That he unnecessarily exposed his troops to destruction, and that he did not make, although it was in his power, any effectual attempt to cooperate with or support the different divisions of the army under his command when engaged with the enemy in the streets of Buenos Aires. So that led to dishonour of His Majesty's arms, to lessen the confidence of the truth and the skill and courage of their officers. So he hasn't maintained the loyalty or the belief, the vote of confidence of those who are under him, which also proved disastrous. And that disruption to power, that fear of revolt from below, people below you in the power structure, is quite a threat in Lewis's work. Okay. So in those examples, masculine duty is associated with order and hierarchy, and Whitelock denied any responsibility other than it being a personal issue which affected his honour. Okay, so if we move on. Thank you. The idea that you should take care of those below you was not an unusual idea for the Lewis family. Matthew Lewis's father had written a letter in 1793 in his role as Deputy Secretary at War about Irish recruits, saying that they should be provided with good soldiers to nurse them, and they need teaching habits of cleanliness and feeding because they're more essential than the knowledge of marching and drill. And if that doesn't happen, then they become a burden, not a benefit on actual service. So it's not an altruistic act to look out for those who rely on you. It has its benefits. Okay. If we move on. How does this relate to Vanoni? Well, it's very much about Vanoni's denial of his social role. A reviewer in the Monthly Panorama wrote that the language of this piece is energetic, but it's frequently the vehicle of false and over-violent sentiments. And he uses that as a criticism. I think he's missing the point. I think Vanoni's language is very much overblown, and we are meant to object to it. We're meant to see it as a problem in him. We're meant to want him to take the Viceroy's advice instead. If we move on to the next, oh, you've already moved on. You've already moved on. Can we go back? Thank you. Sorry. So some examples on this slide. The quotation on the left is Vanoni. She is near here too. Nothing separates us except those bars. I am near her grave. I am near her. I live near her. I will die near her. It's very broken. All he can think about is his lost love. Whereas the quotation on the right is back to James Fordyce. This is from On Love. And he is criticising the depiction of in literature of heroes who have heroines worshipped as divinities, okay, because that corrupts each other with perpetual adoration. That is not love. Moving on again. Thank you. This is Vanoni. We're told he's wandering around the garden with a distracted air. And this is at the point where he realizes it's all been a trick and Josepha's still alive. And he's still inarticulate and unable to conduct himself really with anything resembling heroism. Where shall I direct? Where seek? A cloud obscures my eyes. Despair, rage, powers of vengeance, powers of fury. Guide me, desert me not, give me strength to. My limbs refuse to bear me. I faint, I die. And he falls on the ground. There's also a point where he collapses on the evil monk as well. So, yeah, he is lacking the fortitude of even a Percy character. With that, if we go on to the next slide, though, eye on time. Benvolio is much more controlled and uncontrolled when he is attempting to tell Vanoni to essentially pull himself together and get on with things. In this quotation, he's basically pointing out that Vanoni doesn't have the right to seclude himself. He has got a duty to perform. He says, what right have you to deprive society of talents bestowed on you by nature for the benefit of mankind? Like, that matters more than Vanoni's personal grief. What excuse can you make? The resign to that strangers that wealth, which is your sacred duty to distribute with your own. Like, he should be doing some social good. Heaven has bestowed on you wealth, capable of making the existence of others happy, and your selfish indolence declines an office which saints covet, and for which even the angels contend. So he is really quite forceful. And then when Vanoni asks for pity, Benvolio just interrupts him with the second quotation on that slide, with quite a stoic argument. Why then do I find you in this seclusion? What good is to arise from this servile renunciation of yourself? This forgetfulness of the dignity of human nature. So it is Vanoni's masculinity in the dereliction of his duty that is under threat. And Vanoni not understanding that and being quite weak-willed and allowing himself to be overcome by grief, that's more of a threat than Colestino's lies and machinations. Okay. If we move on again. Okay. This is James Fordyce yet again on the respect due to young men, and he's saying they should be sober-minded, that is to say regular and considerate, careful to govern their passions. That sounds much like a Benvolio argument to me, and not at all like Vanoni's behaviour. It says they should prepare for performing with diligence and discretion the duty to society. And then he goes on. So if we move on. Dare to become a man once more. Restore to your native land that most precious treasure, a virtuous citizen. And then he says that he can't expect other people to be helpful towards him if he is denying his own duty. Okay, so if we move on again, I appreciate this is small. This is to illustrate that Lewis doesn't use those ideas of classical speech and controlled rhetoric in the mouths of his heroes and his patrician characters. He uses it on himself when he is writing to his mother. So that quotation on the left, you ask me how much I know of your difference with my father, whether I could publicly make allowances for you. You suppose my father has been giving me instructions. You accuse him unjustly. He has never said a syllable to me in regard to you. My behaviour is entirely just dictated by my own heart. If that is good, as you yourself have told me, my conduct must be the same. If my conduct is wrong, my heart is the same, and it shall be worth no one's while to seek to have a share of it. And the quotations on the right are ones we've already seen from Sigismund and Benvolio. But what is there is more of that anathema from the start, but also small example of anadiplosis, which is the repetition of something at the start of one sentence and the end of another, which is there when Lewis is writing to his mother when he talks about, I could publicly make allowances for you. You suppose my father. And he's presenting himself as somebody who is righteous, but who is being maligned, unfortunately. Okay, so that is, I think, the end of Venoni. Very briefly, this is a much briefer look at Lewis's final original play. He did put on another version of a play he'd already done after this, but this was his final original play from 1811, Timur the Tartar. This is the year of the Regency crisis and England almost at the point of capitulating in the war with France. It's quite a spectacular example of Lewis's works. It's got dancing horses. It's a hippodrama. And the reason I'm just mentioning it briefly at the end of this talk is because the character Timur, this time an eponymous villain, is used to satirize Napoleon. So he has, it's very loosely based on Tamburlaine by Christopher Marlowe. At the start of the play, Timur has usurped, he's another usurper, the throne. He's holding a small child who's the rightful prince hostage. That's Ajib. Timur's father is his guardian and being kinder to him than Timur realizes. Ajib's mother arrives, disguised as a warrior princess, rescues her son, and then spares Timur's life because she's grateful to Oglu. So if we look at the next slide, there was a recognition from a lot of critics that Timur is essentially representing Napoleon. And there are a lot of reviews that pick up on this one, but this review just illustrates it in great depth. It really extends the metaphor, describes the whole play as a military campaign. So he says, Bonaparte was certainly never in a more miserable condition than he is at present. Lord Wellington has defeated him in Portugal. General Graham has routed him at Barossa, and Mr. Kemble is making a most spirited campaign against him at Covent Garden, borrowing the cavalry of Astley, bringing to bear on him the whole park of artillery on the playhouse. He's attacked him in his own palace. And then later on that, in his attack on Bonaparte, he is as much in earnest as General Graham himself. We have only to express our hopes that the spirit of patriotism and ingenious allegorical representation will extend beyond the walls of Covent Garden House in holding up the great usurper, the Timur of Europe, it's Napoleon, to universal execration. I think that is quite tongue-in-cheek, but it does show that the satire of Napoleon was quite popular in dramas of this time. Timur is described as being physically frightening by other characters, especially by his own father, who said his blood runs cold when he looks at him. He's also described as being, by his own father, as being the oppressor of my country and my sovereign's murderer. And that sense of family duty being at odds with national duty when it should be aligned is also something that is quite common in Lewis's plays. A Jib, on the other hand, has already learnt the importance of that sense of gratitude that we've seen is quite useful in maintaining power relationships. So on the next slide, which will more or less be the last one, this is a Jib talking to Oglu. "'Tis to you I owe every little comfort. If ever my fevered lips drink one breath of pure sweet air, ever my fevered limbs enjoy one wholesome hour of exercise, if I have health, if I have life itself, all is your gift. Since I became your son's captive, no eye has looked on me with mercy save yours, no voice has spoken to me with kindness save yours, yours only." So it's quite dramatic, but it has that sense of gratitude that informed, considered rulers have. And it is represented through that really patterned rhetoric as well. And that is more or less it for me. After this, a year later, Lewis's father dies, he inherits some plantations, and he moves away from writing for the theatre. There we go. I'm done.